Have you ever wondered, what if a CEO, the head of a billion-dollar corporation, suddenly vanished from the corner office, left behind the suits and ties, and chose to live like the most ordinary worker in his own company, not to shoot a TV show, not as a publicity stunt, but simply to quietly listen to the people he had never truly understood? That's exactly what Elliot Kane did. Elliot, a 52-year-old man and the founding CEO of North River Logistics, one of the leading freight companies headquartered in Minneapolis, runs an operation with over 7,000 trucks across North America. To everyone else, Elliot was the epitome of success, disciplined, logical, and never late to a single meeting. But deep down, he knew something was cracking. He felt like he was leading an army whose voices he had never heard. He signed contracts, adjusted KPIs, issued policies, yet he had never once known the name of the driver who drove overnight to save a shipment. Never once asked a logistics worker, "How many hours did you sleep last night?" And then, one March afternoon, as he stood staring at the quarterly roadmap pinned to the meeting room wall, Elliot said something that stunned even his assistant. "I'm hitting the road, living like them. No one's allowed to know who I am." That was it. No microphone, no camera crew, no press coverage. For the next 14 days, Elliot Kane, the CEO of North River Logistics, officially disappeared from the business world. In his place, a man under the alias Eric showed up on the roster of new drivers at a remote branch in Montana. He was handed an old truck and began a journey delivering cargo across state lines. He thought he'd learn a few interesting things to boost efficiency. He assumed this trip would be all about business insight, but he was wrong. Because on a quiet stretch of road under a grey sky, with wheels humming steadily, he met a woman, a driver named Marla, and one conversation that spanned 300 miles completely transformed the way Elliot saw the world, not through PowerPoint slides, not through numbers, but through raw pain and the kind of resilience no one ever noticed. This is the story of a CEO who believed he had built everything, until he realized that the people who helped him build that empire were the very ones he had never stopped to truly hear. The semi-truck with the unit number 1742 rolled out of the lot in Bozeman, Montana, at 6 a.m. Behind the wheel sat a new recruit, tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair, a stiff gait, and clearly not used to wearing a reflective vest. His name, listed on the shift board, was Eric K. No one knew that the man was actually Elliot Kane, the CEO of North River Logistics, who had quietly gone undercover to experience the life of the very drivers he had signed contracts with but never spoken to for more than a minute. Everything felt unfamiliar: the cramped cab, the fold-up bed against the wall, the crackling CB radio, and the lingering scent of engine oil clinging to the driver's seat. On his first day, Elliot took nearly 15 minutes just to back the truck out of the lot without toppling a row of plastic barrels behind him. An older driver, smoking in the corner of the station, let out a scoff and muttered, "This rookie probably never drove past a Walmart lot." The roads stretched out endlessly. Highway signs blurred in the misty dawn. Elliot turned on the radio, but no volume was loud enough to drown out the strange emptiness he felt inside. No emails demanding a reply. No assistant whispering. The board is waiting. Only the sound of tires grinding against asphalt and his own heartbeat, so loud it made Elliot uneasy. That evening, he parked at a small rest stop near Billings. His dinner was a dry burger and a warm can of soda. He sat beside 3 other drivers, but no one spoke a word. Everyone was glued to their phones or staring into space as if they'd grown used to being invisible. Elliot opened his journey log and wrote a single line. I used to think I was the only one under pressure, but maybe I've never truly known what loneliness feels like. On the second day, he woke up in 45-degree chill, neck stiff from sleeping in the wrong position. He missed his delivery window because he misread a printed map. The manager at the drop-off location shot him a cold glare. Next time you're late, I'm reporting you straight to HQ. Elliot bit his lip. In that moment, he understood what it felt like to be seen as a delivery code, not a human being. And then he began to observe more closely. A young driver dozing off in his cab after a grueling 14-hour shift. A woman whispering into her phone at midnight. Mommy misses you so much. Lives passing by as quickly and quietly as the mile markers on the roadside, unrecorded, unnoticed. But Elliot recorded them. Every small detail, every feeling, not for a report, but to get closer to the truth. On the 5th day, as his hands grew more familiar with the steering wheel and his back ached less after every stop, Elliot was assigned a new task: deliver a shipment to Appleton, Wisconsin. A journey of more than 750 miles, and this time, he wouldn't be driving alone. The manager handed him a file. Paired driver, Marla Jensen. 10 years experience. Friendly. Non-smoker. Elliot gave a faint smile for the first time in 5 days. He had no idea that this woman would become the deepest mirror of himself and of all the things he had once overlooked. The white Mack granite truck pulled out of the transfer station at 7 a.m., carrying 2 people, 2 worlds, and a drive that would last over 12 hours. Elliot, or Eric, as the name tag on his shift card read, was fumbling with his seatbelt when she stepped in. Marla Jensen, 38 years old, tall, hair tied back, and eyes that carried the steady energy of someone used to living with challenge. Hey there, rookie. Huh, she smiled, extending a hand. Eric. And you are Marla. But the other drivers call me Cat Mum. Don't ask why. She winked, then nimbly climbed into the passenger seat. The cab was cramped, but the atmosphere quickly grew easy. Marla had a way of speaking that made others feel close, like she carried an old radio playing real-life news, which roads had potholes, which rest stops had the best apple pie, and which station owner secretly hiked up the price of windshield fluid. You know why us drivers always try to stop in the middle of small towns? Convenience? Nope. Because in those towns, people still smile. Elliot just smiled softly. He was used to boardrooms where people smiled for revenue targets, not for a warm slice of pie. About 3 hours into the drive, after switching places behind the wheel a few times, Marla finally lowered her voice. Eric, you drive better than I expected, but I've noticed You keep looking at the dashboard like you're trying to control every single thing." Elliot paused for a second. That line, it was as if she had just seen through a part of him. "I'm used to checking everything. It's just a habit." Marla didn't say anything more, but from that moment on, Elliot began to listen more, not just to her, but to the silences between her words. As the truck crossed the border into Minnesota, the sun began its slow descent over the carpet of forest stretching beneath them. Marla opened a bag of cookies and handed Elliot one. Her voice, soft as a breeze, said, "You ever feel like you're just driving and driving, but have no idea where you're going?" He hesitated, but before he could answer, she continued, "I know where I'm going. I drive for someone." Elliot turned to look at her for the first time with the eyes of someone who was truly listening. Marla shared her story, bit by bit, about her son, Evan, 11 years old, diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disease when he was just 9. About the sleepless nights beside a hospital bed, the medical bills that never stopped coming, and the overnight drives across states with eyes clouded from exhaustion. She spoke as if telling someone else's story, her tone steady, soft, not even close to breaking. But Elliot saw it. He saw her hand gripping the edge of her shirt, saw her eyes fixed on the road, but no longer registering the world outside. "I used to be a literature teacher, but I quit. Paying hospital bills matters more. Every trip I take, I trade away a little more of my dream so that his can keep living." Elliot said nothing. He didn't dare. For the first time, the truck's cab didn't feel cramped because of its size, but because of the grief of a mother, too big to fit inside an 18,000-pound vehicle. That evening, after pulling into a small rest stop near Eau Claire, Marla stepped out first. Elliot remained in the cab a few minutes longer, not because he was tired, but because his heart had never felt so heavy. He unlocked his phone, opened the Notes app, and typed, "The woman sitting next to me today taught me more than every MBA course I've ever taken." Dawn had barely broken when they resumed their journey. White mist blanketed the road, making the outside world vanish into the quiet hum of the engine and the soft breathing inside the cab. Marla was behind the wheel, hands moving with the ease of someone who'd driven this route hundreds of times. Elliot sat beside her, eyes on the road, but mind still caught in last night's story of Evan, of the dreams traded mile by mile. He didn't ask more. He didn't want to turn her pain into some inspiring anecdote. But Marla was the one who broke the silence. "You know," she said, her voice steady and low, as if telling it more to herself than to him. "There was a time I really thought about stopping for good." Elliot turned to her. Marla wasn't looking at him. She was staring ahead at the road, the same road she once believed might be her last. It was right after Evan had his 3rd blood transfusion in a month. I was drained. My account was nearly empty. Relatives kept saying I was pushing too hard. And one night, driving through Iowa, I suddenly thought, maybe I just don't go back. There were no tears with those words. But Elliot felt like something had clamped tight around his chest. I even turned on the blinker, planning to pull off the highway at some lonely exit and just not continue. I was so tired, I felt like a terrible mom. Couldn't give my kid a normal life, couldn't be there every time he spiked a fever. She paused, took a long, deep breath. Elliot didn't dare interrupt. But then, I remembered the look in his eyes as I left home. That boy, hooked up to IVs, still managed to say to me, "Mom, drive safe and stop speeding." Okay, I broke down, but I didn't stop, because if I gave up, he'd think his mom had given up on him. A sharp gust blew through the cracked window, rattling the paper map. Elliot couldn't stop the quiet sob that escaped. He turned his face away, but Marla still noticed the redness in his eyes. She smiled gently, like someone who had just laid down a burden she'd carried for years. "I'm not telling you this for pity. I'm telling you because I know you're listening with your heart." Elliot nodded silently. In that moment, he was no longer a CEO, no longer a boss in disguise chasing some immersive experience. He was simply a human being facing something he had never once seen in a financial report survival. Fragile and beautiful, held together only by love and grit. The rest of that day, they barely spoke another word. Not out of distance, but because they were both replaying everything that had just been shared. That night, as Elliot lay in the cab's bunk bed, his mind swirled with questions. How many drivers like Marla were working for his company? How many had nearly stopped but kept going, just because of a child's gentle reminder? He sat on the edge of the bed, stared at his silent phone, and asked himself, what have I truly been the boss of, if I've never known the people keeping the wheels of my empire turning? And once again, he opened his notes and typed, "She's not just driving a truck, she's driving hope." That night, Elliot didn't sleep. He lay still in the cramped cab, listening to the distant whistle of a train gliding along tracks near the rest stop. Streetlights spilled dim patterns across the truck ceiling like fragmented reflections of his own life, now finally coming into view. For the first time in years, Elliot Kane felt small, not because he had lost power, but because, for the first time, he realized he had never truly known what it meant to live as a human being. He had always believed he was a good CEO, paid salaries on time, gave out holiday bonuses, approved quarterly charity funds. But none of those things ever taught him that mothers like Marla were sleeping in the driver's seat because they couldn't afford a place near their child's hospital. Didn't help him understand what it meant to deliver freight across 3 states just to make it home before your kid spiked a fever. Elliot sat up abruptly, opened the small notebook he had brought along, a notebook originally meant for jotting down operational efficiency insights. But this time, he didn't write numbers. He wrote names. Marla Jensen, North Central Route, truck, num 1742. Son Evan, age 11, receiving treatment at Minneapolis Children's Hospital. Likes apple pie, old children's books. Fear that no one would remember her if she disappeared. Reason, she keeps going. One small gaze, one simple sentence. With every line he wrote, Elliot felt like layers of dust were falling away from his heart. He was no longer writing as a CEO, but as a student copying down the first lesson in compassion. The next morning, they didn't say much. Marla started her day with her usual strong coffee. Elliot adjusted the side mirrors 3 times before pulling out of the lot, but something had changed. Marla noticed Elliot slowing down more carefully at the gas station. He asked the attendant about his shift, bought an extra apple pie for a boy back home, and as the truck crossed the steel bridge over the Mississippi River, Elliot said something Marla didn't expect. "Thank you for not pulling over that night." Marla's hands paused on the wheel. She didn't reply, just gave a quiet nod. In that moment, the cab was no longer just a cockpit. It was a space for healing where 2 very different people were carrying a truth farther than any shipment ever could. That afternoon, as the truck pulled into its final delivery point in Milwaukee, Elliot watched Marla quietly from behind. She was laughing with a young warehouse worker, showing him how to use the new scanning system. Sunlight slanted across the loading bay, casting her shadow onto the ground, steady and calm. Elliot realized something. He used to think of himself as the one leading the system, but in truth, that system only functioned because of people like her. No commands needed, no praise required, just the simple need to be seen and valued. That night, in his small notebook, Elliot wrote, "I used to think silence was emptiness, but it turns out silence is where the loudest truths echo." The following days passed with a familiar rhythm, starting the engine at dawn, fueling up at midday, and catching quick sleep under the glow of rest-stop lights. Only one thing had changed Elliot's way of seeing the world. Before, he saw drivers as resources. Now, he saw human beings with heartbeats, with pain, with quiet battles no one ever awarded. At every rest stop, Elliot observed more closely. A middle-aged man folding a small piece of newspaper and placing it next to a photo of his late wife in the cab. A young woman silently video calling her elderly mother in another state, lying that she was doing fine just to keep her mum from worrying. He began writing everything down, not as business notes, but as a journal of empathy. Day 9. Met Rick, North Dakota route driver. Lost his son in a car crash while Rick was on a night shift. Hasn't taken a day off since. Reason feels he doesn't deserve rest. One morning, under light rain, Elliot stopped at a roadside diner in Iowa. The waitress was an older woman, her left hand trembling slightly. Pinned to her collar was a small badge. "My daughter is my miracle." As she poured his coffee, Elliot smiled and said, "Your daughter must be very lucky." She froze for a moment, then replied, her voice quivering, "No, I'm the lucky one. She taught me that. There's still light even when you can't see the way anymore." Elliot returned to the cab, but his heart wasn't as steady as when he first arrived, not because he was weak, but because his heart was learning to feel again after years encased in logic and spreadsheets. He turned on the cabin light, pulled out his notebook, and added one more line. "My company is running well, but the people are not. If I do nothing, then I am part of the forgetting. Marla had left 2 days earlier, finished her route, and returned home to Evan. But her presence lingered every time Elliot glanced at the rearview mirror. That gaze, that voice, like a quiet compass guiding a journey that was now transforming his very soul. During breaks, Elliot began approaching other drivers, not to inspect but to ask, "How's the road been lately? Anything wearing you out? Which rest stops got the best pancakes?" And he listened as if it were the most important job he had ever done. A young driver who had first seemed cold and distant pressed a bag of snacks into Elliot's hand after they'd talked for a while and said, "Keep this for the night drive. With the way you drive, I bet you can't handle the cold." Elliot chuckled, not because of the snack, but because he felt a connection, one that came not from title, but from listening. That night, parked on the outskirts of Des Moines, Elliot sat alone in the cab, wind tapping gently against the truck's side. He looked out at the cloud-covered sky and whispered, "If my own child had to live Marla's life, would I be brave enough to be her?" There was no answer, but one thing he knew for sure: he was no longer the man who had stepped into that truck 2 weeks ago. And tomorrow morning, when he returned to the office as CEO, he wouldn't be carrying a route report. He'd be carrying the stories of the people who carried the company with their hearts. The final day of his undercover journey passed in a silence that no longer felt awkward. Elliot returned the truck keys to the branch manager in Minneapolis. He gave a nod, revealing nothing, still just a temp driver finishing out a 2-week contract. As he left the yard, he paused by the row of trucks ready to roll out. Then he stopped in front of an old chipped Mack truck, the very one Marla had driven. Before walking away, he took out a small piece of paper, scribbled a few short lines, and tucked it into the door slot. "This trip taught me something I never understood in all my years as a boss. Some people don't drive for a paycheck. They drive because they're keeping someone alive. Thank you, Eric." The next day, Elliot Kane walked into the North River Logistics headquarters. No one knew he had just returned from the longest 2 weeks of his life. No suit, no tie, just a man who had shed an old self and brought back a changed heart. Inside the 18th floor boardroom, the entire executive team was already seated. The top-level managers, financial advisors, and strategic heads. One of them asked, "Where have you been? We've noticed fewer emails than usual." Elliot simply smiled and replied, "I've just been learning how to be human again." No one understood what he meant, but when he turned on the projector and began to speak, the room fell completely silent. He didn't talk about output. He didn't analyze profit margins. Instead, Elliot spoke of the people he had met over the past 2 weeks, a father who lost his son while on a delivery route, a young woman too afraid to call home because she couldn't answer the question, "Are you okay?" and a woman named Marla who nearly pulled over for good, if not for a tiny pair of eyes that believed Mommy would come home. Elliot looked up, meeting the gaze of everyone in the room. They don't need our pity. They just need to know we see them. Then he laid a document on the table, a thick, detailed proposal. A 20% increase in base pay for long-haul drivers, creation of an emergency support fund for employees and immediate family facing critical illness. A 24/7 anonymous mental health counseling system free for all staff. A Voices from the Cab program requiring every executive to join at least one ride-along per quarter, anonymously, without privileges. A finance director furrowed his brow. Do you realize how much these policies will cut into next quarter's profits? Elliot nodded without hesitation. I do, but I also know this: if we keep running a company that only looks at spreadsheets, then one day we'll lose the very soul of what we've built. The boardroom was silent, but it was no longer the silence of doubt. It was the silence of something deep being stirred, something everyone had forgotten. The meeting ended. Elliot stood alone by the large window, looking down at the traffic below. He once thought leadership meant making the right decisions. Now he understood real leadership is having the courage to choose kindness, even when it's not the most efficient. That afternoon, he composed an email not to the entire company, but to just one person. The woman with a smile as warm as a rest stop light in the cold night. The one who taught him that sometimes a nameless driver can teach an entire corporation how to be human again. Less than a week after the executive meeting, the North River Logistics Internal Bulletin lit up with a headline that stunned every employee. CEO Elliot Kane announces sweeping reforms for the drivers, not the metrics. That very day, a short video was sent to over 12,000 employees across the corporation. No professional lighting, no branded backdrop, just Elliot Kane in a rolled-up shirt, sitting in a modest office cab with a voice that was deep but steady. For the past 2 weeks, I've lived among you, not as a CEO, but as a trainee. I've heard things I never had the courage to ask. I've witnessed sacrifices no paycheck can measure. He paused briefly, then continued, and I've come to understand something. No one among us should be left behind just because the system failed to see them. Within 48 hours, the new policies rolled out across the company. 1. Long-haul pay raise. Interstate drivers received immediate notice of a 20% base pay increase. One veteran driver burst into tears after a call from HR. He couldn't believe it. They actually did it. This isn't a dream, too. The Companion Fund Emergency Program. A new fund was launched, the Companion Fund, to provide financial support for employees and their loved ones facing critical illness. What made it different? No red tape, no efficiency scorecards. Just one honest story was enough. 3. Mental health support. A fully anonymous 24/7 mental health counseling service was launched the same day, completely free. One employee called in for the first time and simply said, "No one's ever asked if I was okay." 4. Voices from the Cab program. Each quarter, 5 senior executives would be assigned to a 3-day long-haul trip under a hidden identity. No work phones allowed, no revealing who they were. Just climb into the cab and listen. The changes spread like a warm breeze in the middle of winter. Transfer stations sent back photos of drivers hugging, smiling, holding signs with handwritten words: "I am seen, I am heard, I am believed in." Elliot chose not to appear in the press. He held no PR conferences. Instead, he quietly visited each branch, sat in canteens with the drivers, and asked small, human questions. How many hours of sleep did you get last night? Which stop has the best pancakes? And he took notes. Handwritten messages began appearing on bulletin boards. We don't just haul freight, we carry trust. A young office employee who had once hidden behind dry logistics reports shared a post on the internal network. I used to think this was just a company, but today I realize we're part of something more right than anything I've known. Elliot read every word, and every night he opened that same old notebook, the one that held his entire journey. On the last page, he wrote, "This isn't a reform. This is how we return to being human." One early fall morning, the skies over Minneapolis were strikingly clear. Soft sunlight filtered through leaves turning amber, casting a golden glow over the headquarters of North River Logistics. On the 19th floor, usually reserved for board meetings, a special appointment was underway. No cameras, no reporters, just Elliot Kane and the woman he owed an honest face-to-face, Marla Jensen. Marla walked into the room with hesitant steps. She wore an old denim jacket, her hair tied back. She thought she was there for a routine contract follow-up, invited oddly by the HR department. But when the door closed and the man at the head of the table looked up, she froze. 1 second, 2 seconds. The room seemed suspended in time. Eric. Her voice was barely audible, like she couldn't trust her own ears. Elliot nodded, slowly rising from his seat. "I'm sorry for not saying it sooner. My real name is Elliot Kane. I'm the CEO of North River. But during those 2 weeks, I was just a trainee, and you were my first teacher." Marla stood still, her eyes wide, one hand gripping the strap of her bag, unsure whether to be angry, cry, or walk away. "I never meant to hide forever, but I had to be certain that when I came back, it wouldn't be as the old boss, but as someone new." Elliot stepped closer and placed a thin folder in front of her. Not a contract, but a detailed proposal, a support program for single mothers in the trucking industry, designed around Marla's story. "I presented this to the executive board, and I want you to lead the program. You won't have to drive cross-country anymore. You'll have more time with Evan, and you'll still be a beacon for the thousands of drivers out there who need a light in the dark." Marla looked at Elliot for a long moment. Then the tears came, not from hurt, but from something even more powerful. She was seen, and she was believed in. "You really listened to me. Not just listened. I learned, and I'll never forget." Elliot handed her a photo. It showed the cab where they once drove across 3 states together, and scribbled on the side of the truck, in handwritten letters, was a line where a mother once thought of stopping, and where a CEO began again. Marla laughed through her tears. "If Evan finds out, he's gonna ask Mom, did you really talk to your boss like that?" Elliot chuckled softly. "If Evan's up for it, I'd be happy to take another ride just to reintroduce myself." They both fell quiet, not from awkwardness, but from honoring the moment. That rare, perfect moment where 2 distant worlds finally found each other. not through titles, not through power, but through one simple truth. People can change when someone dares to tell their story. A week after that meeting, Marla received a call from North River's main office. The voice on the other end was gentle, almost moved. "Hello, Ms. Jensen. CEO Elliot Kane would like to invite you to speak at next month's company-wide summit as our honored guest speaker." Marla froze. "Me, a speaker? But I'm just a driver." The staff member simply smiled through the phone. "No, not anymore. You're a symbol now." That evening, Marla sat alone in her backyard, cradling a cup of tea, eyes watching Evan build a castle out of blocks. It had been a long time since she could sit for more than 10 minutes without worrying about a shift, a bill, or an urgent haul. The phone buzzed once more this time. It was a message from Elliot. "I've created a new fund. It's called the Evan Jensen Foundation. Its mission to provide financial support for trucker families with children battling chronic illness. The first person I want on the executive board is Evan's mom." Marla didn't respond right away. She simply turned to look at her son, the little boy who once asked, "Mom, why do you drive so much?" And now, she finally had an answer. "Because you are the reason I never gave up." 2 weeks later, at North River Logistics' annual company summit, for the first time in the company's history, a former long-haul driver took the main stage not to receive an award, but to inspire. Marla stood there, no fancy blazer, no lofty title, just herself, a woman who almost gave up, but was heard by a stranger and walked into a new chapter of her life. "I'm not a hero," she began. "I'm just a mum who once feared that if I disappeared, no one would notice." She paused, scanning the silent crowd of hundreds. "But today, I'm not here to talk about me. I'm here to talk about you. About those still driving through the night, calling their kids, but not staying on the line long enough to hear the ring. About those surviving every day, not because of recognition, but because of one quiet belief that someone, somewhere, might finally see them." The entire room stood up, one by one, without being asked. And Elliot Kane from the very front row was the first to applaud. From that day forward, Marla no longer sat behind the wheel each morning. She became Director of Human Values and Employee Life, a brand new role created just for her. She no longer hauled freight. She now led initiatives that changed lives. In its first year, the Evan Jensen Foundation supported over 200 families with critically ill children. Some finally had enough to afford specialized care. Others broke down in tears upon hearing, "We've got this part covered. Just stay by your child's side." Evan, the boy who once saw his mother only through a phone screen, had now become a quiet symbol of resilience. On the glass wall inside the company's headquarters, where the names of individuals who sparked change were etched, the first name engraved wasn't Elliot Kane. It was Evan Jensen, the reason my mother didn't stop. Months after that historic summit, a small ceremony was held on the west lawn of North River Logistics headquarters. No fancy backdrops, no media lights, just birdsong in the trees, neatly arranged chairs, and a simple wooden podium. Elliot Kane stood there, holding a bronze plaque. Beside him was Marla in a crisp white shirt, and Evan, now healthier, his thin but radiant face glowing with a bright smile. The plaque was mounted onto a brick wall at the front lawn, where every employee walked past each day. Hand-carved into the metal were the words, "Here is where a mother once thought of stopping, and a CEO learned how to listen." Beneath it, in bold print, "We don't just move freight, we carry dreams." The crowd applauded, not loudly, but warmly, as if someone had just opened a window and let fresh air stir every heart present. Elliot turned to Evan, knelt slightly, and asked softly, "Would you like to say something?" The boy nodded, pulled out a small sheet of paper, and nervously read aloud. "I used to think my mom was a superhero, but now I know she's just someone who never gave up." The courtyard erupted in emotion. But to Elliot, nothing struck deeper than Evan's final words. "And I think, if more grown-ups listened like Mr. Elliot, there'd be fewer people crying alone in their trucks." From that day on, Eric, the name Elliot, once used during his undercover journey, became an unofficial symbol across the company. Every time a new leader joined North River, the story was retold like a rite of passage. If you want to understand this company, ask about Truck 142. Many employees quietly signed up their children for the support program. Others, even those not in need, donated to the Evan Fund because they said, "I just want to help someone keep going." Marla no longer appeared in company newsletters, but every time North River hosted a corporate culture seminar, there was always one slide dedicated to her, bearing the title, "The One Who Taught Us Sometimes to Save a Company." You don't need to change the system, you just need to listen to one person. That night, Elliot sat alone in his office, the lights soft and low. On his desk lay the old notebook, now filled from cover to cover. He flipped back to the first page, where he had once written, "I set out to find answers about efficiency." And on the very last page, he wrote, "I found something more important. A single person who is heard can lift an entire company to its feet, and someone brave enough to share their pain holds the key to everyone else's growth." He closed the notebook, stood up, turned off the lights. On the desk remained a single handwritten note. "Marla taught me that some roads don't need GPS to be found. They only need someone real enough to lead the way. Some journeys seem designed to test your stamina, but in truth, they resurrect the soul." The story of Elliot Kane, a CEO who once lived by spreadsheets and performance metrics, reminds us, sometimes, to be a great leader, you must first relearn how to be human. And that lesson didn't come from business school or high-powered consultants. It came from an ordinary woman. From Marla Jensen, a mother who once collapsed, but never allowed herself to quit. Their story didn't begin in a glossy boardroom, but inside a truck cab rolling through a misty highway. where two strangers, both carrying loneliness and a longing to be understood, crossed paths. And through real stories and a silence full of listening, they rewrote what success means. No longer double-digit growth, no longer winning bids, but rather, how do we make sure a truck driver doesn't have to cry alone in a cab? How do we ensure a sick child gets to see their mother every week? And how do we make every employee feel I matter, even in silence? You don't have to be a CEO to change the world. You just have to be the first to pause and listen. Because sometimes a sincere question like, "Are you okay today?" might be the only thing keeping someone going. Because a truly strong company is not the one where everyone runs the fastest, but the one where even the weakest are never left behind. So if you're in a leadership role today, step out of your office, go where the quietest voices in your organization are speaking. Listen not to correct them, but to understand them. And if you're the one carrying too much in silence, feeling invisible, unheard, please hold on. Because maybe your story is the one that will change everything. This story isn't just Elliot's. It's not just Marla's. It's all of ours, for everyone trying, each day, to live a little more kindly in a world too busy to look back. If you ever thought a delivery was just about freight, remember some trucks have carried life, courage, and humanity. And if you're driving one of those today, we see you and we thank you.